There is a highway in Canada, 724 kilometers long, that cuts through some of the most breathtaking wilderness on Earth. Towering pines, mountain mist, silence so deep it feels sacred. But for decades, that silence was hiding something. Dozens of women and girls vanished along this road. Some were never found. And for years, the world simply looked away. This is the story of Highway 16 and the families who refused to let it remain a secret. Highway 16, officially known as the Yellowhead Highway, stretches nearly 750 kilometers across northern British Columbia, connecting the city of Prince George in the east to the coastal port of Prince Rupert in the west. It passes through small towns, remote reserves, and vast stretches of forest where the nearest neighbor could be 40 kilometers away. For the indigenous communities along this corridor, the Wet'suwet'en, Gitxsan, Carrier, and others, this road is not just a highway. It is a lifeline, connecting families to hospitals, schools, employment, and each other. But there is a critical problem that has persisted for generations. Public transportation along Highway 16 is nearly non-existent. Bus routes are limited. Taxis are expensive or unavailable. For many residents, particularly young women traveling between communities, hitchhiking was not a choice made carelessly. It was often the only option available. This structural gap, this absence of basic infrastructure in indigenous and rural communities, would become one of the most significant and most overlooked contributing factors to everything that followed. The cases began accumulating quietly. A young woman who never arrived at her destination. A daughter who called home and then went silent. A friend who stepped out one evening and simply did not come back. The RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, officially documented 18 cases of missing and murdered women and girls along Highway 16 between 1969 and 2006. But Indigenous advocacy organizations have long argued the real number is significantly higher, some estimates reaching 40 or more, once adjacent highways and underreported cases are included. The victims were overwhelmingly young. Many were Indigenous. They ranged in age from their mid-teens to their early 30s. Among the most documented cases is that of Ramona Wilson, 16 years old, who went missing in June 1994 near Smithers, BC. Her disappearance, like many others, was initially treated as a voluntary absence by authorities. Her mother, Matilda Wilson, would go on to become one of the most determined advocates for justice along the Highway of Tears, spending years pushing for the attention that institutional systems repeatedly failed to provide. The pattern was deeply troubling. Cases were frequently under-investigated, families were not kept informed, and the broader public largely remained unaware that women were disappearing at a disproportionate rate along this remote corridor. For years, official investigations into the Highway of Tears cases were fragmented, under-resourced, and according to the families of victims, systemically dismissive. A landmark internal RCMP review later acknowledged that cases involving Indigenous women were, in some instances, assigned lower investigative priority. Reports were delayed, follow-ups were sparse, and the geographic spread of the highway, crossing multiple RCMP jurisdictions, meant no single unit owned responsibility for connecting the pattern. It was not until 2005 that a coordinated initiative, Project E-PANA, was formally launched to reinvestigate the Highway 16 cases as a connected series rather than isolated incidents. Project E-PANA eventually reviewed over 30 cases. Investigators found no single offender responsible for all disappearances, suggesting multiple perpetrators across several decades. One of the convictions that emerged was that of Bobby Jack Fowler, an American drifter, later identified through DNA evidence as the killer of Colleen McMillan in 1974. Fowler had died in an Oregon prison in 2006, never prosecuted for crimes in Canada during his lifetime. The investigation also highlighted a troubling reality: the highway's remoteness, the vulnerability of women with no alternative to hitchhiking, and a law enforcement culture not adequately equipped or motivated to protect them. To understand how this pattern persisted for so long, we need to examine not just individual perpetrators, but a broader psychology of institutional silence. Criminologists and sociologists who have studied the Highway of Tears cases point to what is known as the devaluation hypothesis, the documented tendency within systems of authority to assign lower urgency to cases involving individuals perceived as socially marginalized. Low-income women, Indigenous women, those assumed to be in vulnerable circumstances. This is not a comfortable conclusion, but multiple independent reviews, including Canada's National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, confirmed that systemic bias in policing was not incidental. The psychology of identified perpetrators also revealed patterns. Bobby Jack Fowler fits a profile well known to forensic psychologists: an itinerant individual who exploited geographic isolation, victim vulnerability, and near certain knowledge that disappearances in remote areas would receive minimal investigative attention. The road itself created conditions that enabled harm: long distances, sparse witnesses, a transportation vacuum that forced vulnerable individuals into high-risk situations not of their own making. Understanding this psychology is not about excusing anything. It is about dismantling the conditions that made it possible. Here is the part of this story that rarely makes it into mainstream coverage. While attention over the years has focused on perpetrators and policing failures, a quieter and perhaps more revealing failure has gone largely unexamined: the failure of infrastructure. In 2006, community members, Indigenous leaders, and local advocates gathered in Smithers, BC, for what became known as the Highway of Tears Symposium. The resulting report made 33 concrete recommendations, not primarily about policing, but about transportation. Bus routes, rideshare systems, phone access in dead zones, safe houses for women traveling between communities. Nearly 2 decades later, only a fraction of those recommendations had been fully implemented. The forgotten dimension of this story is this: the Highway of Tears was not simply a crime story. It was, and remains, a public infrastructure story. A story about which communities receive safe roads, reliable transport, and connected services, and which do not. The Carrier Sekani Family Services, one of the Indigenous organizations that fought hardest for change, documented the transportation gap in stark terms. In some communities, the nearest functioning bus stop required a 90-kilometer round trip to reach. When that reality is understood, the Highway of Tears looks less like an isolated series of crimes and more like the predictable outcome of a decades-long infrastructure gap never considered urgent enough to fix. In June 2019, after 3 years of testimony from over 2,380 survivors, family members, and knowledge keepers, Canada's National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls released its final report. Its conclusion was historic. The inquiry concluded that the systematic violence against Indigenous women and girls in Canada constituted genocide, as defined under international law. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration, a legal and historical finding. The report made 231 individual calls for justice, directed at governments, institutions, police services, and Canadian society at large, calling for overhauls to policing standards, mandatory cultural competency training, dedicated funding for Indigenous-led safety initiatives, and direct investment in transportation infrastructure in remote communities.